There is a winter almost nobody remembers now. In 1363 to 1364, the cold across much of Europe became so severe that the Rhine near Mainz stayed icebound for about 70 days, and in Cologne, a market was reportedly held on the frozen river itself. That is not folklore dressed up for television. It comes out of documentary climate research built from medieval written records. So stop and imagine it. A river turned into a road, a marketplace set on ice, and somewhere beyond the great towns, villages facing the same winter with timber walls, straw roofs, mud floors, and a fire that could not be allowed to die. And yet most villages did not simply vanish under snow. They suffered, yes. They starved sometimes. They lost animals. They buried the weak. But again and again, they survived. The mystery is not that medieval winters were brutal. The mystery is why so many villages kept going through them, and the answer is stranger than they were just tougher. The truth is that a medieval village was not a random scatter of huts. It was a system built for endurance. Almost everything in it had a second purpose in winter. The house was shelter, but also a heat trap. The barn was storage, but also emergency space. Animals were food and labor, but also warmth. Grain was dinner, but also insurance. Family was affection, but also survival technology. Neighbors were not just nearby people. In bad weather, they were part of the margin between life and collapse. Medieval villages rarely survived by comfort. They survived by design, habit, and cooperation. And that brings us to the first trick. The first survival trick was brutally simple. Build small, build tight, and waste as little heat as possible. In Northern Europe, many medieval rural houses were timber-framed, filled with wattle, plaster, or earth, roofed in thatch, and fitted with only a few small windows because glass was expensive. Gregory Clark's synthesis of pre-industrial living standards notes that basic houses were often roughly 450 to 675 square feet with 2 or 3 rooms, and that the whole family often slept together in one bedroom. That sounds cramped because it was cramped, but that crampedness mattered. A small house loses less heat than a large one. Tiny windows leak less heat than big ones. Low-cost materials like earth, plaster, and thatch were not luxurious, but they were local, repairable, and familiar to the people living inside them. When a blizzard hit, villagers were not trying to create airy interiors. They were trying to keep enough warmth close to bodies. In other words, what looks primitive to us often worked exactly the way it needed to. The second trick was the one every winter village revolved around. Never let the hearth become just a fire. Make it the center of everything. In medieval peasant housing, the hearth heated, cooked, dried, illuminated, and organized the day. Smoke rose toward a hole, louvre, or vent in the roof, but it did not all vanish instantly. Some of it lingered under the rafters, and though that was miserable for lungs, it also meant the house was not built around modern ventilation priorities. Christopher Dyer's work on peasant houses describes halls where the hearth was the main living focus, while Clark notes smoke escaping through the roof opening in basic houses. In a deep freeze, that central fire was not cozy decoration. It was the line between survivable cold and deadly cold. And here's the twist. The danger inside those houses was often not freezing. It was fire. That sounds dramatic, but it is grounded in the evidence historians use to reconstruct medieval domestic life. Rural houses were smoky, dark, crowded, and full of open heat sources. The world inside was one of live embers, boiling pots, hot iron, candles, and straw. That matters because it destroys the fantasy that peasants spent winter in unheated shells. No, they lived amid constant heat, just heat that was dirty, risky, and unmanaged by modern standards. Their problem was not the absence of warmth. Their problem was how to hold on to it without burning the house down or choking on it. And fire alone still wasn't enough. The third survival trick was to treat animals as living heat banks. Clark notes that in many places animals were quartered inside the house or below it so that their body warmth could help heat the dwelling. Christopher Dyer adds an important nuance. Peasants did not always have specialist buildings for every purpose, but in severe weather animals were likely to be placed in barns, which were multifunctional structures. Archaeological evidence from peasant farm sites shows a range of arrangements: byres built into longhouses, yards for animals, separate animal buildings, and flexible farm clusters in which housing and livestock space could shift over time. To a modern eye, that sounds unpleasant. To a medieval villager, a cow or a flock of sheep represented traction, manure, milk, and in winter, one more source of heat and survival under the same working landscape. So the village was not just a place where people lived. It was a place where bodies, human and animal, helped keep each other alive. That logic runs deeper than it first appears. Straw was not just bedding, it insulated animals and people. Manure was not just filth, it restored fertility to fields. Barns were not just storage sheds, they were flexible winter infrastructure. Dyer explicitly describes pastoral farming as making a vital contribution to rural production, and Clark emphasizes that the medieval agricultural economy depended on renewable sources of labor, energy, and animal power. When storms closed roads and snow-buried paths, the village fell back on the resources already within its own orbit. The medieval household was poor in luxury, but rich in interdependence. And then came the fourth trick, the one modern people tend to find most uncomfortable. The fourth trick was closeness. Shared beds, shared rooms, shared warmth. Clark notes that families typically slept together in one bedroom, and Barbara Hanawalt's work on peasant families shows how tightly organized the household was as the core unit of survival in medieval England. That was not simply social custom, it was thermal logic. One fire could not efficiently heat a whole modern-sized house. But one family, sleeping under rough textiles in one concentrated space, could hold warmth together through the night. Privacy is expensive in a cold world. Medieval villagers paid for warmth with closeness. And if that sounds oppressive, remember the alternative. More space, more drafts, more cold, more death. The fifth trick was to store calories before winter could demand them. Medieval villagers did not survive bad weather by improvising every meal after the snow started falling. They survived because much of the year was spent preparing for the season when almost nothing grew. Grain formed the bulk of the peasant diet. The evidence from rural household material culture and dietary records shows grain consumed as bread, pottage, and ale, with wheat, barley, and oats frequently appearing in household records and archaeological evidence. Documents also point to stored grain measured in bushels and quarters, and historians of grain storage emphasize that medieval people saved a great deal because seed, food, and next year's survival all depended on it. In other words, the medieval village lived by the bin, the loft, the stack, and the barrel long before the first real storm arrived. And when those stores ran thin, the whole village began to feel winter in its teeth. The food itself was practical rather than glamorous. Rural household evidence shows preserved meats such as bacon, salt beef, mutton, pork, and salted fish appearing in inventories. While archaeological evidence suggests vegetables and cabbages were also core parts of rural diets even when written inventories under record. The same material culture research notes that preserving pork allowed it to be eaten throughout the year. That is exactly the sort of thing that matters in a blizzard. You do not need fresh luxury. You need food that keeps. You need calories that last. You need something that can hang, dry, salt, or wait until roads reopen and fields thaw. And this is where the story turns dark, because history also records what happened when that trick failed. In 1315, chroniclers began describing a catastrophe that spread across much of Europe. The summer rains were so heavy that grain could not ripen properly. Trokelowe's chronicle describes a dearth that started in May, eased only briefly, then returned around Christmas. Another translated excerpt notes that meat and eggs began to run out, animals died because fodder was too expensive, and a quarter of wheat, beans, or peas sold for ruinous sums. Henry S. Lucas's classic study concluded that the famine of 1315 to 1317 struck lands from the Pyrenees to the plains of Russia and from Scotland to Italy. This was the nightmare scenario for any medieval village. Not simply cold weather, but a broken chain of grain, fodder, and reserves before winter had even finished with them. That is the key distinction. Blizzards were dangerous, but empty stores were fatal. And that leads to the sixth trick, perhaps the most important of all: survive as a village, not as isolated households. Gary Richardson's study of medieval English agriculture argues that peasants did not face risk alone. He shows that medieval villagers formed institutions of risk-sharing, fraternities that protected members from the perils of everyday life, and customary poor laws that redistributed resources toward villagers struck by bad luck. Christopher Dyer's work also stresses that peasants belong to communities visible in village layouts, greens, churches, church houses, and guild halls. Medieval winter survival was therefore never just my house versus the weather. It was also our village versus misfortune. If one household lost an ox, another might lend traction. If one family was struck by sickness, kin and neighbors mattered. If snow and storm cut movement, the local community became even more decisive, and that collective instinct may be the most underrated survival technology in history. Because once you see it, the medieval village changes shape in your mind. It is no longer a random cluster of poor huts. It becomes a compact machine for reducing risk. Small houses kept heat close. Hearths turned smoke into usable warmth. Animals added labor, manure, and body heat. Families concentrated sleeping space. Food and seed were stored against scarcity. The community itself redistributed danger whenever it could. None of this made life easy. None of it made winter safe. But it made winter survivable often enough that villages endured century after century through weather harsh enough to freeze rivers, lock roads, and stop trade. And there is one more real winter incident that captures exactly how brutal the outside world could become. Gregory of Tours, writing about a winter more severe than usual, says streams were frozen so hard they became paths, and birds, weakened by cold and hunger, could be caught by hand in the deep snow. That image is unforgettable because it tells us two things at once. First, medieval cold was not romantic, it was lethal. Second, chroniclers recorded such winters precisely because they were extraordinary. Villagers expected winter hardship. They built for it. They prepared for it. They feared it. But when the season became so savage that birds stopped escaping and rivers became roads, that was the kind of event people remembered for generations. So no, medieval villages did not survive because the weather was kinder than we imagine. They survived because their entire world was organized around not wasting heat, not wasting food, not wasting labor, and not wasting relationships. In modern life, survival often looks individual. In medieval life, survival was collective and material. It was the wall patched before winter, the fire guarded through the night, the pig salted in time, the seed kept back instead of eaten, the ox sheltered, the child sleeping close to the mother, the neighbor who still had grain when your barrel ran low. That is what made a village hard to kill. And maybe that is the most dramatic truth of all. When the blizzard came, medieval people did not wait for rescue. Rescue was already there, built into the structure of village life itself. It was in the house, in the barn, in the hearth, in the animal stall, in the grain chest, in the shared blanket, in the customs of the village, in the expectation that misfortune had to be met together, because no one family could fight a hard winter for long on its own. That is why medieval villages so often bent without quite breaking, not because they had conquered winter, but because they had learned over generations how to live inside it. And that is the image to leave with. Outside, a white and merciless world, a river frozen into silence, wind tearing at thatch, paths buried, animals restless, and hunger always one bad season away. Inside, a low room blackened by smoke, a hearth still alive, grain measured carefully, bacon hanging, a child asleep under coarse cloth, a cow shifting somewhere nearby. And a family that has done all 6 things it can do: build tight, keep fire, use animals, sleep close, store food, and trust the village. Not comfort, not safety, but enough. And in medieval winter, enough was a kind of genius.